The Battle of Cannae was the climax of a long struggle between ancient Rome and the North African merchant city of Carthage, located in modern-day Tunisia. In the 3rd century BC, Rome was rapidly expanding its power. Only Carthage stood between it and total domination of the western Mediterranean. Starting in 264 BC, the two civilizations fought a bloody war for supremacy, known as the First Punic War. In 241 BC, Rome was victorious, and took large amounts of western Sicily from Carthage. In the years following the First Punic War, Carthage gained a strong foothold in Hispania. Tension with Rome began to increase as Carthage gained new land and strength. Finally, the Second Punic War began in Hispania in 218 BC. The Carthaginian general Hannibal Barca realized that Carthage lacked Rome's manpower and endurance, so he decided to attempt to end the war quickly through a large surprise attack on Roman territory. In the winter of 218 BC, Hannibal led an army of 60,000 men and several dozen war elephants out of Hispania and made for Italy. To maximize speed, Hannibal decided to cross the Alps. In the freezing conditions, half of his soldiers died or turned back. When the army arrived in northern Italy, it had 30,000 weary, hungry men. The Romans, however, were caught totally by surprise by the rapid appearance of hostile forces in northern Italy and hastily assembled an army to counter the Carthaginian attack. This force, led by consul Publius Scipio, was crushed by Hannibal at the river Trebia. A year later, Hannibal ambushed and destroyed another Roman army at Lake Trasimene, killing the consul Flaminius. At this point, the Romans decided to regroup and avoid open battle with Hannibal's army. The Carthaginians took the opportunity to move up and down Italy, ravaging the countryside unopposed. Hannibal also recruited large numbers of Gallic tribesmen from northern Italy. The Romans spent the next year building up an enormous army they believed would be capable of finally defeating Hannibal. During this period, the Roman army was comprised of volunteer soldiers who joined the army until the war ended, then went back to their previous lives. The Roman infantry had proved itself to be a formidable force, mostly because of its excellent discipline and equipment. The Romans called themselves the Sons of Mars, and this was reflected in their highly committed and successful army. There was no need to hire mercenaries, because Roman citizens were usually eager to fight for their country. The army mobilized against Hannibal for this third encounter was the largest Rome had ever fielded, 87,000 strong. Hannibal's army, on the other hand, was much smaller, with only 50,000 men, and had inferior equipment. The elephants which had given them an edge in previous battles had also all died because of cold weather. The Carthaginians made up for this, however, in their experience and the genius of their commander. The Carthaginian army was comprised of a much more diverse group of soldiers. These included mercenaries from Gaul and Hispania, whom Hannibal had recruited just before or during his attack on Rome. Unlike the Romans, almost none of the soldiers felt like they were fighting for patriotic reasons. Instead, they were motivated by the potential for loot, hatred of Rome, and their devotion to Hannibal. Most experienced men Hannibal commanded were the Libyans and Numidians. The Libyans alone among his infantry were equal in skill to the Roman legionaries. The Numidian cavalry were legendary light horsemen, taught to ride bareback from childhood, and superior to any cavalry the Romans possessed. The Roman army was so large that both the year's consuls, Gaius Varro and Lucius Paulus, commanded it, each holding supreme power on alternate days. Both consuls were eager for a battle, because victory would increase their political power and popularity. They chose the land near the town of Cannae to fight the battle, because it contained enough flat open space to hold their entire army and let them take advantage of their superior numbers. Against the advice of Paulus, on August 2nd, 216 BC, Varro hoisted a red flag outside his tent, the traditional Roman signal to prepare for battle. The Roman army deployed in a typical formation. This was known as the triplex acies. It was comprised of 3 lines of heavy infantry. The cavalry was placed on the flanks of the army. Hannibal realized that his infantry couldn't possibly hold back the huge number of Roman legionaries. He therefore devised a brilliant battle plan. He placed his infantry, shown in red, in a crescent formation, with the center nearest to the Romans, but kept his elite Libyan infantry in reserve. He placed his 10,000 cavalry on the flanks. From there, he waited for the Romans. The massive Roman army advanced, confident in its superior numbers. Varro and Paulus commanded the cavalry on either flank. Just before the Roman infantry reached his front line, Hannibal's cavalry charged and engaged the 6,000 Roman cavalry. After a short but bloody fight, the Roman cavalry was routed and fled in disorder. Meanwhile, the Roman infantry broke into a charge and slammed into the center of the Carthaginian crescent. This was the sort of melee engagement the Romans excelled at. Slowly, the line of Gallic and Spanish mercenaries was driven back into the center, and the crescent was flattened. As the Romans continued to push forward, the consuls ordered their second lines into the fray. The Roman army's elite regiments and files began to disintegrate into a tightly packed mob, still pushing forward relentlessly. Although the Carthaginian front lines fought bravely, they continued to be forced back, with great loss, until an inward-facing bulge formed at the center of the Carthaginian line. At last, the pressure proved too much, and the Carthaginian center fell back in retreat. The Roman infantry surged forward, certain of victory, but it was then that Hannibal sprung his trap. Units of fresh Libyan infantry, which had until then been hidden in reserve, wheeled in to outflank the Roman infantry, and surrounded it on three sides. At the same time, the Carthaginian cavalry returned and charged back with the Roman army. The Roman infantry was now completely surrounded. Trapped and exhausted from the fighting, the Roman legionaries' position was hopeless. They were so tightly packed together that many couldn't use their weapons. They were completely disorganized. With nowhere to flee, they were all eventually slaughtered over the next 4 hours. When the sun finally set on Cannae, the Roman army had been completely destroyed. According to the Roman historian Livy, almost 50,000 Romans had been killed, and 20,000 who'd been guarding the Roman camp had been captured. 80 senators had been killed, including Paulus. Hannibal had lost 6,000 men. It was one of the bloodiest battles ever fought, and the worst military defeat Rome would ever suffer. When Varro returned to Rome with the survivors, the city was utterly shocked at how completely its armies had been defeated. Immediately, preparations were made to fortify and defend the city of Rome itself, but Hannibal never made an attempt to take the city. His army didn't have the equipment it needed to carry out a siege. Whenever the Carthaginians waged war, they expected to end a negotiated settlement. When Hannibal sent diplomats to Rome to negotiate the city's surrender, however, they weren't even allowed to enter. This was because Rome's culture emphasized never negotiating with the enemy until Rome held the advantage. After long debate in the Senate, Rome decided to raise more armies and continue the struggle against the Carthaginians, despite the horrendous defeat. When Hannibal sent messengers to Carthage, asking for the men and equipment he would need to take Rome, his political enemies within Carthage ensured that no support came. Ultimately, the political disunity in Carthage would prove calamitous for Hannibal. The war continued for another 15 years. The Romans raised huge numbers of soldiers, at one point enlisting a third of their adult male population, over 300,000 men. But Rome did not intend to use these men against Hannibal. While he pillaged Italy, Rome ignored him and concentrated on conquering the Carthaginian province of Spain. When this was done, Rome moved to attack the city of Carthage itself with an army composed primarily of survivors from Cannae. This army was commanded by Publius Scipio, another veteran of Cannae, and one of the greatest generals Rome would ever produce. He was also the son of Publius Scipio I, the consul Hannibal had defeated at the river Trebia. The government of Carthage hastily summoned Hannibal and his army back to defend their capital, but too few of his veteran soldiers had survived the nearly 2 decades since the start of the war. To compound Hannibal's problems, Carthaginian citizens were reluctant to enlist in the army, preferring to leave the fighting to mercenaries. Scipio had also persuaded the Numidians to betray Carthage and join Rome. As a result, Hannibal was defeated at the Battle of Zama by Scipio and the treacherous Numidian king Massinissa. The tables had been turned. Carthage was now placed in a similar situation to the one Rome had been in after Cannae. However, the Carthaginian Senate lacked the will to continue the struggle and sued for peace, ceding large amounts of territory in Spain to Rome and agreeing to pay a huge indemnity. Carthage would never again be a power capable of challenging Rome. Despite Hannibal's brilliant tactics at Cannae, Rome had triumphed because of his persistence as well as the remarkable commitment of his citizens. After Carthage was defeated, the rest of the Mediterranean was conquered easily by Rome. Rome had learned from its defeat and never again let an enemy threaten its capital for hundreds of years. Perhaps the true importance of Cannae was that it taught the Romans how to continue the struggle, no matter what the cost. The memory of Cannae still lives on today. The tactics Hannibal employed are still taught at military academies, and the word Cannae has become synonymous with total victory. When German General Erwin Rommel was driving his British opponents back in North Africa and during World War II, he wired Berlin the message, "A new Cannae is in the making." More recently, US General Norman Schwarzkopf said that he used the Battle of Cannae as the basis for a similarly decisive Operation Desert Storm. Perhaps more so than any other battle of the ancient world, Cannae stands out in a multitude of ways. in its tragedy, its tactics, its scale, and its legacy. Insofar as it helped create the Rome which would eventually conquer the entire known world, Cannae was a truly decisive battle, which shaped the course of the history of the world.